Hello and welcome to this week's Why Football podcast with me, Michael Dryden, and Etches Adokru. This week I am very pleased to say we are joined by Lee Scott. Lee is an experienced football scout and opposition analyst and is lead analyst at Total Football Analysis. Today, Lee will be talking to us all about his latest book on Liverpool, King Klopp, Rebuilding the Liverpool Dynasty, which is out now on Amazon, Waterstones, WH Smith, and all good retailers. Lee's also authored Mastering the Premier League, the tactical concepts behind Pep Guardiola's Manchester City. And he's also currently writing a book all about Marcelo Bielsa, due to be released early next year. So hello Lee, thank you for coming on the podcast today. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks very much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
No, absolutely, it's a pleasure. Etches, how are you?
Yeah, I'm not too bad at all. Been really excited to get Lee on, so it's fantastic to have him here. How are you, Dryden? You well?
Yes, I'm very good, very good. Very excited for the Premier League start today, starting with Arsenal, your team. So very interesting, but I'm sure they'll be okay. I'm sure they'll do quite well.
Yeah, filled with quite a lot of optimism. We've made a few signings. I really am a big fan of Arteta, so hopefully, we are against Fulham. Hopefully we get the 3 points. Otherwise, I'm in a really bad mood for the rest of today. Obviously, Lee, you've released this book, which we actually bought a copy of ourselves, which are getting through. And one of the questions I really wanted to know was specifically at Borussia Dortmund, Jurgen Klopp had this. I think they used to describe it as a very heavy metal style of football. And I kind of wanted to know how he took that style of football and brought it to Liverpool. Did it kind of change? Did he morph it? And if so, how?
Yeah, I think the heavy metal style of football is directly referring to the gegenpressing style. And when Jurgen Klopp first signed for Liverpool, you couldn't go anywhere or read any article or read any blog post or tweet that didn't reference the fact that gegenpressing was coming to the Premier League.
Yeah.
In Germany, that was a very specific style of play. And it's funny because that's something, I'll get on to the point about the way that he's changed that at Liverpool in a second, but gegenpressing in itself is the reason that Pep Guardiola had to change his tactical system when he moved to Bayern Munich in Germany, because the tactical system that he had at Barcelona with the short passing and the positional play and moving players by moving the ball, all of that was made more difficult in Germany because so many teams counter-pressed so aggressively, gegenpressed. And Jurgen Klopp's Dortmund were a perfect example of that. They were so aggressive. Whenever they got the ball, everything was vertical. When they didn't have the ball, everything was vertical because they pressed. When he first came to the Premier League, I think that in the first season, we saw elements of that through Liverpool's press. Gradually over the years, though, and then culminating in last season, we saw a change from Jurgen Klopp in Liverpool and his game model at its very core. So no longer, they still press. Make no bones about it, Liverpool are still one of the highest pressing teams in the Premier League. They still counter-press the immediate transition, which means when they lose the ball close to the opposition goal, you will see the likes of Firmino, Salah, Mane all look to press immediately. But then after that, the press becomes almost less aggressive. They drop into a more medium defensive block, if you like, and then get organised defensively. And that's just a nod towards Jurgen Klopp decided that he wanted Liverpool to play less in transition. Transition is essentially chaos in football. The transition from defence to attack, everything is chaos. Everyone's after the ball. You're trying to press to prevent the opposition from playing through you. The transition from defence to attack is the same thing but the other way around. So you're trying to play through the opposition, so everything's quick, everything's fast. But this last season, we saw Jurgen Klopp transition to a style that was more about control. So he wanted to dominate games a little bit more. He knew that teams would sit back and defend in deeper blocks because of the attacking threat of Liverpool. And he found a way to adjust his system just enough so that they still had enough of that chaos around them, but they also had more control of the game. I think that's the biggest change that we've seen in this Liverpool side from the Borussia Dortmund side. But certainly, Borussia Dortmund heavy metal football is one of the best ways to describe that Borussia Dortmund team, because they were fantastic to watch, but everything was almost out of control, and that's the way he wanted it.
Yeah, you make a really good point about the control elements of Liverpool. I remember watching Liverpool versus Sheffield United. This not the one with the Wijnaldum deflected goal, the think it was the home victory for Liverpool, where they broke the number of passes in the one Premier League game that season, which I found quite interesting because I wouldn't have originally ever associated that level of control and possession for a Klopp team when I used to watch Dortmund and also the early Liverpool. So it's interesting how you noted that level of control that you touched on before. So the next question I kind of had was, so we're saying how he's adapted it to the Premier League and, how Liverpool have changed over time. In the last year or so, a year and a half, or even going into this season, how do you think they'll actually change even more? Or do you think they're set now?
I think that at the moment, going into this game today, we're recording on Saturday morning, so Liverpool play Leeds in the tea time kickoff, if you like.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of this, the last 5 or 6 weeks from Liverpool, has been centred around the speculation that they're going to sign Thiago. I think that the reason that Liverpool are so keen to sign Thiago, it goes beyond the fact that he's a world-class midfielder, because he is. From a technical point of view, from a ball progression point of view, he is a world-class midfielder. What a lot of people don't understand, though, is that he's also a world-class midfielder in terms of his defensive output, in terms of his ball recoveries, in terms of his ability to understand how to block passing lanes and how to press effectively to force turnovers. I think that if Liverpool were able to sign a midfield player like Thiago, then you would see a transition into a different style of the way that they progress the ball, which I think is the next evolutionary step for Liverpool. Last season, the progression was mainly through the fullbacks. So we had Trent Alexander-Arnold obviously coming into a more inverted position from his right-back position, from where he could play those diagonal passes, or he could play those clipped balls in behind the defensive line, or even just fire vertical through balls that just skim across the ground at the feet of Roberto Firmino, who was invariably in space. I think that the left back, the progression was different because it was more through Robertson receiving those passes and then making runs with the ball that broke the lines of the opposition. Beyond that, the progression from Liverpool, ball progression, was slightly less centre orientated, if you like. So they didn't really use the midfield to progress the ball. They didn't use the likes of Fabinho, Wijnaldum, or Henderson to progress the ball. They were more functional than anything else. I think that in order for, we saw a couple of times last season. It's funny that you mentioned Sheffield United. Sheffield United were one of the few teams who caused Liverpool huge problems last season because they were so effective at taking away the threat of the full-backs progressing the ball. That's something that the defensive system of Chris Wilder was set up specifically to stop that, and Liverpool really found it difficult to break them down. I think that now, going into this season, Jurgen Klopp wanted to add an option in the midfield through which they could have a ball progressor. So if the fullbacks are taken out of the game, you still have a player in the midfield who can progress the ball. So that would be Thiago. They have Naby Keita, who I still believe it has the potential to become one of the best midfield players in the Premier League. The issue around Naby Keita, obviously, is his injury record, and Jurgen Klopp's not, I don't think, convinced that he can count on him for a full season. But Keita gives you that. Keita gives you the ability to take the ball centrally and then beat a player either through a dribble. So he's very good at driving with the ball himself in one-on-one situations and even taking out two players through a dribble, or through passing the ball intelligently. We've seen that a couple of times. There was one pass in particular last season when he played an assist to Sadio Mane, and when you saw there was a certain angle of the TV camera showed in the replay, and everything just seemed to slow down around him. You could see players moving between the two of them, and Naby Keita just timed the pass perfectly. I think he does give you that option, but because he's not going to be available that much, and he perhaps not as good defensively as Wijnaldum, for example, he might not be used that much. So as things stand at the moment, I expect to see almost the same game model that we saw last season, but that could all change depending on activity in the transfer market.
Do you think that will alter Bobby Firmino's role?
Potentially. The role of Bobby Firmino is so unique in world football. It's really difficult. I did a project for a client last season when we were essentially trying to identify players who had a similar skill set to Bobby Firmino. It's extremely difficult to find a number 9 who plays the same way he did. When he was at Hoffenheim, he was a 10. He was a player who played in that 10 position naturally and got up to support the striker. He made very good delayed runs in the penalty area. He invariably found himself in space. He scored a lot of goals that way. When he first signed for Liverpool, obviously there's all the talk about the fact that the manager at the time didn't like him and didn't want him. Brendan Rodgers preferred to play him on the left-hand side of the attack. He didn't see the value of having Firmino as the 9. But his role for Liverpool is so unique because of the runs that he makes from the 9 position back towards the midfield are what creates the space for Mane and Salah to attack from the outside centrally. So they essentially become a 1-2, if you like. So if you think about it on a pitch, you have Firmino in the 9 position. Because of the movements of those two wide forwards, they almost become 2 9s because they play so centrally.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that the ability of a player like what's great about Naby Keita for me is how he can interlink with that player. You see him play good passes at good angles into Firmino, for example, but then he makes the next run. So he makes the pass into Firmino, then Keita continues to run into space, and Firmino has the quality to be able to find him. That presents real opportunities for Liverpool in terms of creating central overloads. So all of a sudden, you have a pass being played into Firmino, you have Salah and Mane coming in behind him, and you have Naby Keita moving in that same central area from deep. You can imagine the difficulties that causes for any defensive block, and that's the key for Liverpool. That they still need, even against these teams that sit deep in defensive blocks, they still need to find those pockets of space that Firmino and Keita and Mane and Salah can occupy, because that's how they build up in the final third, if you like, and from there it all becomes about individual qualities. We talk about tactical systems and runs and overloads and isolation and all these different tactical terms, but essentially when the ball comes to that zone outside the penalty area, it all becomes about whether you have the individual quality to finally break down the opposition, whether that's the final ball, whether that's beating the last defender, whether that's getting a shot away at a good angle. And that's something that Liverpool have, because obviously they're a world-class team. So I think that the ability of a midfield player to progress the ball just adds an extra layer, if you like, to the Liverpool attack, as opposed to fundamentally changing anything they do at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. We touched on Sheffield United earlier and how they kind of thwarted the fullbacks of Liverpool, the wing-backs. We also kind of saw that with Napoli in the Champions League. So the next question would be, how do you stop this Liverpool side? But is there a Premier League side who are really well equipped, or in the last season or so, have stopped Liverpool very effectively?
I think the obvious one is obviously Sheffield United, who we've already talked about. But to move on from that a little bit, you referenced Napoli and their performance in the Champions League, particularly the first Champions League group stage match last season, when Napoli played almost a 4-2-4 system. They realised that if you take the fullbacks away in terms of ball progression from Liverpool, so they had their 2 wide midfielders, if you like, almost man-mark the Liverpool fullbacks out of possession. So Trent Alexander-Arnold and Andy Robertson couldn't get clean ball progression because they were so well marked. The default for Liverpool beyond that, because we've already talked about the fact that the midfield is so functional, is to use Virgil van Dijk and either Joe Gomez or Joel Matip to progress the ball from the centre-back position. But Napoli pressed their forwards up so that they were man-marking those players. And Liverpool really struggled to affect anything in the attacking phase because Napoli were so effective at taking away their progression options. I think that obviously we can draw a direct parallel to the fact that Napoli side was coached by Carlo Ancelotti, who's now coaching Everton. So it'll be really interesting to see the first Merseyside derby this season, to see if he tries to do something similar to take away that threat from Liverpool, from the fullbacks, and from the likes of Virgil van Dijk. But you can go slightly further. I mean, there are so many tactical systems within the Premier League now. It's almost a melting pot, if you like, of all these different coaches and different ideas and different philosophies. I don't think that Liverpool will enjoy playing against Southampton this season because Ralph Hasenhüttl is going to press so aggressively, and that'll be something that Liverpool will struggle initially to play through. Yes, there will be opportunities in the final third. They'll have opportunities where they can get the ball to Salah or Mane one-on-one and make something happen, but that first ball progression won't be as clean as Liverpool want it to be. And then you have the likes of Burnley, who are always difficult to break down, but Sean Dyche will have his team set up in such a way that they will look to be so compact that they'll deny space for Liverpool. So it's that space that we talked about in the last question about where Firmino drops into a pocket of space to pick up the ball. Against Burnley, that's very difficult because they're so well organised and so well drilled that that pocket space isn't always there. You have to always attack down the outsides more. And that's not something that comes naturally to Liverpool because obviously their main threats all move inside the central areas to try and overload there. So there are a number of different sides, I think, and that's not even touching upon the obvious one, which is, of course, Manchester City, who will be difficult for Liverpool to play against. But I think that it's always hard because when you're the champions, you always come up against teams who are more specifically set up, if you like, to counter your strengths as opposed to trying to play to their strengths. So it might be a somewhat different season this year for Liverpool.
Yeah, no, that is really, really interesting. I was hoping you're going to mention Arsenal causing Liverpool loads of its problems.
I don't think anyone's going to like playing against Arsenal this season, to be honest. I think Arteta is very, very smart. You already saw in the Community Shield match how they sat in that such a deep, compact defensive block, but then because they're so well coached and how they progress the ball from the back, that the whole playing out from the back thing that Arsenal got a lot of stick for under Unai Emery. You can see the difference between that and what they do now under Arteta in terms of the angles of the passes, the sharpness of the passes, the positions the players take up to receive. And it becomes so effective because they're able to play through teams so much better. And then as soon as they play in the deep block in order to get the opposition to come on to them, and then they're able to play through them because they play out the back so well, and then release the likes of Aubameyang and behind it. It's going to be really, really interesting to see how they set up against Fulham today because I don't think they'll be able to be that deep. So I'm looking forward to watching Arteta's team this season.
Yeah, same here. It'll be a really interesting encounter. Another question I wanted to ask you was I had a discussion with my friends, so I have a few Liverpool fans as mates, and to them, Henderson is, in their eyes, it was a discussion around the PFA Player of the Year award, which went to Kevin De Bruyne, and they felt that Henderson was a worthy winner, which depending on who you are, it's up to you. But the question I kind of had was they see Henderson as irreplaceable, not just in the Liverpool team, but in any setup in the Premier League. And that was a discussion but we've kind of felt that Henderson is really, really functional with this Liverpool team in terms of his role. And I wanted to ask you how key he is to their current setup.
Henderson's really interesting. When you think about, in football, it's natural for us all to have this almost sense of confirmation bias around football players. We watch football over the years, and automatically you will evaluate and you will assign players in your own head. So for a long time at Liverpool, Jordan Henderson played as the six at the base of midfield. And people, rightly so, in my opinion, said that he wasn't good as a six. He played there for England as well. He doesn't progress the ball well through his passing, which is what a six should be able to do. So there was a lot of talk at the time about how he was always safe with the ball, always sideways, always backwards, never looking to move the ball towards the opposition goal, which should be the overall aim of any team's tactical structure, to get the ball towards the opposition goal to try and score a goal. I think that this last season, we really saw Henderson back being able to do what he does best, because when he first signed for Liverpool, when he came from Sunderland, he was a box-to-box midfielder. He was a player who took advantage of his limitless energy, if you like, and he was always up around the opposition penalty area. He was always back defending around his own penalty area. He seemed to be all over the pitch, and that's something that a lot of fans look at, and they see effort and aggression and the ability to always be around the ball, and they associate that with a good player. I think that what Jordan Henderson gives this Liverpool side is that balance that we talked about earlier on. So Liverpool moved from the chaos of gegenpressing and transition football into a more controlling style, but it's such a fine line. They're not purely controlling. They still have elements of chaos, and it's that chaos that Jordan Henderson thrives in. So he really, really thrives in transition. If you think about when the opposition lose the ball, I talked earlier on about the fact that they still counter-press the first instance, and Jordan Henderson is often the midfield player who goes and does that because he can't help himself. He just loves pressing the ball. So he'll go up, he'll press the ball, he'll try and win the ball back. If the ball gets played over the top, Jordan Henderson has the energy to move back. But he's also very, very selfless for his team. We also talked earlier on about the fact that the role of Trent Alexander-Arnold has changed this last season. He was now coming inside more, and from there he could affect the game with his passing ability. In order for Trent Alexander-Arnold to make that movement from right back into the half space in the inverted right back position, there had to be space made, and that means that Jordan Henderson almost sacrifices himself and moves from that position that's the same position that he would be in where Trent moves into. Jordan Henderson has been the player who then flips outside to the right wing, if you like, and he provides a width for Liverpool. And it's all about his role for Liverpool almost makes everything else that they do from a possession point of view work, because he's willing to take the hit and move into areas that he wouldn't normally. I think that's what a lot of Liverpool fans this last season have really seen. It's something that stood out to me while I was researching the book, that he was incredibly important without perhaps ever showing up when you look at the data. I spend a lot of time in my day job looking at data around football, and it's very difficult to quantify exactly what Jordan Henderson does through a data lens. But if you watch the game and you watch his contributions, you can see just how important he is. I would still argue that Liverpool fans perhaps overstate his importance, especially in a wider Premier League context. I don't think there are many people who would, for example, swap him in any starting 11 for Kevin De Bruyne. I think that if you did, you're perhaps viewing the game slightly wrong, just in my opinion.
Just a bit.
But you can absolutely see how a midfield that had Kevin De Bruyne and Jordan Henderson in it would be very, very successful. I think it's more not about directly swapping one player for the other, but how they could work, because they have completely different player profiles. Kevin De Bruyne is obviously a progressive passer, whereas Jordan Henderson is the anarchist in the midfield, if you like. Maybe that's a good way to describe him. He's an absolute anarchist. Tactical restrictions don't really work for Jordan Henderson, and we saw that when he played as a six. He wasn't himself. But when he's given freedom to move around the pitch and do what he does best in an anarchic style, suddenly you see him become the player that he is. And as the Liverpool captain, there's no doubt that he's a key player in this Liverpool side.
Well, what's interesting, when he was at Sunderland, he actually came through as a right midfield player, as a very, very young, slender man. Then he was moved centrally alongside Boyle Zenden. And then when he eventually went to Liverpool from Sunderland, I think it was just shy of 20 million, there was a lot of people shaking their heads at Sunderland. I'm a Sunderland fan, and probably across the country. I think it was Dalglish that signed him. And there's a lot of question marks. And you do wonder where he'd be today in the absence of Klopp. Because as you rightly say, his role has now become very specific to watching the transition phases.
I think he nearly left. Liverpool prior to Klopp coming in. There was a lot of talk. I can't remember. Was it Fulham that nearly signed him? He was certainly going to be allowed to go, and I believe that he was going to be allowed to leave for around the 20 million mark. So obviously Liverpool were at that point happy to cut their losses, if you like. Then all of a sudden he becomes the player that he always showed the ability to be. I mean, I remember him playing for Sunderland. I remember his performances that season before he signed for Liverpool. He was fantastic. You could see why top clubs were looking at him, because yes, he's got the homegrown aspect. Clubs want to sign young English talent because it benefits them in the long run. So that always gives you a boost in terms of how clubs view you, if you like, in the Premier League. But he just seemed to have something different that a lot of midfielders had. There was a lot of equations at the time to Frank Lampard, because he had that ability to arrive in the penalty area. And that's something that teams crave. It's really interesting to see how it's almost a sliding doors moment, isn't it? If Jurgen Klopp doesn't come in when he comes in, then where is Jordan Henderson now? Is he at Liverpool? Probably not.
Yeah, and I think coaches relish a raw talent, and he was very much a raw talent when he was at Sunderland. He had the energy, as you said, he had the fight, and he did have the technical ability, but he very much was a product to then take and mould in the shape of your team, and that's what Klopp seemingly has done. And I'm just hoping that he retires in 3-4 years' time and comes back to manage Sunderland. I imagine we could do with a big name. But moving on to kind of what is next for Liverpool, we've touched on tactically, and I mean this kind of feeds in. But in terms of this window, do you expect Liverpool to strengthen? We've talked about Thiago. They've brought in Tsimikas from Olympiacos, but from a squad point of view, it's potentially still quite thin in certain areas.
I think so. I think that, obviously the signing of Tsimikas was very, very important, because they needed somebody to cover for Andy Robertson left back. Now, as somebody who's Scottish, I I want Andy Robertson to play every game and never get injured, but unfortunately that's not something that's likely to happen. So signing a left back and not having to rely on James Milner to keep going and going and going and going at left back as cover was something that was really important. I think beyond that, there's an argument to be made for the fact that they're still light. Centre of midfield is one, but Curtis Jones has shown huge promise. We don't know enough about him yet to talk about his player ID and which role that he'll take up in the Liverpool midfield, because to me, he looks like a more offensive midfielder than somebody who perhaps is functional. He looks like somebody who likes to be around the final third to make those passes, which is an interesting option to have. You talk about cover for the wide forwards, because obviously Shaqiri's never really impressed. Origi is still perhaps living on those goals that led Liverpool towards the Champions League a little bit. Liverpool fans won't like that potentially, but his performances last season, I think, were relatively poor. Whenever he was given a chance, he never seemed to do well. There's talk now about Roy Brewster perhaps going out and leaving Liverpool, even on a permanent transfer with a buyback clause. I've heard talk about that, because he's a pure finisher type, if you like. He's a Robbie Fowler in the Liverpool attack, and that doesn't necessarily fit the way they play. I mean, we talk about squad building, and we talk about how you create a squad to play a specific tactical style. It's very, very difficult to replicate what Liverpool do if you take Roberto Firmino out of the 9 position. We saw that last season. Early in the season, when Firmino wasn't available, Sadio Mane played as the 9. But immediately you're changing the makeup of that team, because where Firmino likes to come deep to link play, Mane likes to make runs in behind. So you don't have the same progression abilities, and you have a striker who's looking to make completely different runs, and it changes the dynamic of the whole team. I think that you take something away from Sadio Mane when you have him starting his runs from a more advanced position, as opposed to starting his runs deeper, when he's able to time it to break through the defensive line to get behind onto the ball that's played behind the defensive line. I think it becomes difficult for Liverpool at the moment to recruit that 9 position, and that's something I think they are still looking at. I always thought that Sebastian Haller, who signed for West Ham last season, was possibly one of the closest things I've seen to Firmino. He didn't quite come off at West Ham, but I think that's more of a fact that nobody comes off at West Ham, so it can be a difficult one. I think that in terms of what they're going to try and do, I think that there will be time for the likes of Harvey Elliott to play as one of the wide strikers at times. They have young players coming through the defensive line. They like Nico Williams, who's looked excellent, as a potential right back replacement. And if he plays right back and there's a problem in midfield, and does Trent Alexander-Arnold finally make that transition that some people think he's going to into the midfield? And again, that changes the dynamic. So I think that Liverpool are one of the smartest clubs in world football at the moment in terms of their squad building and their recruitment. They've already shown this window that they're not going to be pulled into financial battles, if you like, in terms of chasing targets. When the price went up on Timo Werner, and the fact that they couldn't guarantee Timo Werner that he would start ahead of that front three, they pulled out despite their fans' consternation. There's been talk that they obviously went in for Jamal Lewis, the Norwich player who's just signed for Newcastle United, the left back. He would have been a fantastic addition for Liverpool, but because the price wasn't right, they pulled out. They signed Tsimikas instead. They obviously have a system through which they place valuations on players, and they're not willing to go above the upper limit of that valuation. And I understand how the fans and onlookers are unhappy about this, because there's so much furor around the transfer window and about teams having to, it's almost an arms race. You have to go out and spend and sign the next player, the next player, the next player. Sometimes, especially with football as it is just now, in this post-COVID, it's not really post-COVID because COVID is still very much a factor, but this COVID landscape is different. It's harder. It's not, Liverpool don't want to just go out and spend, because the whole thing that FSG had when they took over Liverpool is that they wanted it to become this self-sustaining organism. And it is that their wage bill is extremely high, but that's paid for through prize money and through place in the Champions League and the league table, everything else. And money is there for transfers, but it has to be the right deal, which is why I think that there's still noise about Thiago. I think Thiago makes sense. Thiago is the one, despite the fact that he's maybe slightly older than a Liverpool side would potentially be otherwise. He's the one who might come in. Otherwise, I think that they'll go for the same squad and just try to use youth players, if you like, to fill any gaps.
Yeah, it's interesting that you touched on Timo Werner. He's one of the players what is linked heavily, and I know he's since moved to Chelsea. How do you think he would have fitted into Klopp's system?
Almost perfectly. I think that he's obviously a completely different profile. We just spent time talking about the profile, how difficult it is to find an extra Roberto Firmino. I think that when Timo Werner first came through at Stuttgart, he was a left winger. Very, very good and promising left winger before he moved to Leipzig, because they play more of a 4-4-2, if you like, not very loose 4-4-2, but a 4-4-2. He became a striker almost by default because of his ability to make those runs out the left-hand side, almost in the same way that Thierry Henry used to do, to move out to pick up the ball on the left and then cut inside. I think Timo Werner would have been an option as any of the two wide forwards because of their specific role for Liverpool, and that they start outside and come inside. He would have done that very well as opposed to being the 9 specifically. I think he'll do very, very well at Chelsea. I don't know exactly how they're going to play this season, whether they're going to try and fit Abraham and Werner together, because Werner can obviously play as one of a two. He did this whole time at Leipzig. He's in my fantasy football team, so obviously I think he's going to do quite well. So I think he would have been excellent under Klopp, because he's coming from a team, when you talk about heavy metal football and gegenpressing and pressing aggressive football, he's coming from a team at RB Leipzig who's part of that Red Bull group, and their entire playing philosophy is built around that gegenpressing heavy metal football. That's why I think you're seeing Liverpool go to these clubs to recruit from. That they obviously took Naby Keita, who started initially in European football. He played for a French second division team called Istres, and then he moved to RB Salzburg. Then he used the pathway to move to RB Leipzig, and he lit up the Bundesliga, and Liverpool went and got him. This last year in January, they went and got Takumi Minamino, who I think could well be a fantastic signing for them this season. I think we're really going to see the next evolution from Minamino, and everybody was impressed with what they'd seen from Minamino in the Champions League group stages. Liverpool went out and activated a release clause that got him at an absolute bargain. And he's one that I perhaps didn't touch upon in the last answer, because he's a player who I think will also play as one of the wide strikers. He will play as the 9 at times, because he has that same, doesn't do it as well at the moment, but he has that same ability to drop off the line to link play that Firmino has. So there are interesting options, and I think that with the likes of Timo Werner and other players within that Red Bull network, if you like, Liverpool have obviously identified something using their analysis and the data that they use and the algorithms that they use, that these players have a specific player ID that's coached into them that fits the way that Jurgen Klopp plays. I think that's why it's very, very likely that we'll see them turn to that network time and time again to recruit players, but then don't be surprised if they do it in the future to recruit coaches when Jurgen Klopp eventually leaves.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned Timo Werner in your fantasy, because I took him out this morning, and I think I'm going to miss the deadline, so I'll be quite stressed about that one. But it's interesting that you mentioned how well he would have fitted in, and Liverpool's other options. In general, I think it's really interesting about the arms race that you mentioned. Liverpool are champions, and it's one of those things that when you're champions, you worry when everyone else strengthens around you, that you must sign, you must improve, you must get rid of this guy because he's not performing or whatever, etc. And the follow-up question I had is, do you think Liverpool will still, you mentioned the options of Minamino, do you think they'll still look for someone wide as well, or is that dependent on, Shaqiri, as you mentioned, is disappointing before, and you mentioned the young players that are coming through?
I think in terms of wide options, they're probably okay as things stand at the moment in terms of the recruitment for the first team just now. I think that, as we said, Minamino will play there, Shaqiri can play there, Origi already said that I wasn't impressed by him last season, but he will play from the left side occasionally. And Harvey Elliott is the great hope. He's a player who I think there were reports after his first training session with the first team that players were going up to the coaching staff and asking who the hell this kid was who disappeared. And it wasn't his technical ability. I think that if you're a 16-year-old, 17-year-old, and you reach the point where you're allowed to train with the first team of a Premier League team, your technical ability will be on point. What they were really impressed with Harvey Elliott was his physicality. He's very slight, he's not very tall, but he wasn't being pushed off the ball easily. And he wasn't somebody who they found it easy to hold off when they were in possession, because he understood how to press and how to engage and how to use his body, if you like, to get around the ball. And that's something that really came out in initial reports about Harvey Elliott. The coaching staff and the players love him. I think that we'll see him get more exposure at first team football. I think that the wide forward positions are more something that Liverpool need to start looking at in terms of succession planning, because now we're getting to the point where I think that if COVID wasn't a factor, we would have spent the entire pre-season hearing reports about Real Madrid and Barcelona in talks to try to sign Salah and Mane. Those are the two players that I think that the Spanish giants, if you like, because every year they try to poach the next big thing, apart from this year, because of the financial situation the Spanish clubs are in. I think that we would have spent the whole season hearing about how they're trying to sign these players, and players invariably become unsettled because there's talks ongoing, negotiations. I think Liverpool are at a point now where they have to be succession planning. So they have to be planning for the invariable moment when those players do leave, whether that's through natural regression, which takes them below the level at which they need their first choice players in that position to perform, or whether that's through them moving on to another club, because it will happen in football. Eventually, they will either regress, retire, or move. And Liverpool are already, I believe, that, as we've already said, they're one of the smartest clubs in terms of recruitment and squad building in world football. Make no doubt about it. They're already planning for that to happen. And that's something that happens more in the background, if you like, whereas they're not recruiting immediately for the first team just now, but instead they're building their shortlists and their reports, and they're doing their due diligence to make sure that they have options to come in. So they will know about players out there they like for those positions. They just won't be looking to pull the trigger yet.
And I mean, Edwards has been famed for the work he's done around the analytics and bringing in a lot of these players. You touched on players up. I think you touched on, I think with Firmino when he came in, it wasn't popular with the manager at the time, but that's obviously down to the due diligence done by people like Edwards and the recruitment team. And we've touched a lot on the youth players here. I also know that Lovren left in the window to Zenit St. Petersburg. And they also had quite a few players out on loan. So you had Wilson out on loan, Grujic, Ryan Brewster was out on loan the second half of the season. There is quite a pool of these young players, and we've touched on Jones and Elliott and Williams. There's also Sepp van der Berg. And if you take away the defenders, or you take away the defensive side of Liverpool and the goalkeeper, the average age going upwards, the midfield and the attack, is creeping up quite a lot. Do you think we're going to start seeing a succession plan? I mean, you touched on it a fair bit, but do you think we're going to start seeing these players actually get embedded into the team, which is a gamble, or start signing at a lower kind of age bracket?
I think it's going to be a mix of both. I think that this season, again, because we're in the COVID situation, I think this season we're likely to see the average age of the squad brought down by these players who have come back to the club. I mean, I think that some of them will be moved on. I don't believe that Grujic will play for Liverpool. I think that he'll be moved back to the Bundesliga and they'll look to make a profit. But the problem they have is that if the financial situation around European football wasn't as it is now, they would probably be able to drive a price of around €30 million for a player like Grujic, which would have been good business considering what they signed him for. And the fact that I think he's maybe played a handful of times for Liverpool's first team, but he's spent the last 2 seasons on loan at Hertha Berlin. I think that they're perhaps holding on to him a little bit to see if need drives the price up towards the end of the transfer window, which always tends to happen. You see, if you inquire about a player at the start of the transfer window, you're quoted one price. If the same club, then the club will then say, no, I'm not paying that because that's too high. The same club will then come back and be willing to pay that towards the end of the transfer window because all of a sudden they're feeling the pressure. And the pressure is driven by fandom and by social media and by people believing that this club needs to go out and sign a player in this position. So I think that they'll potentially move Grujic on as the season comes closer. I think you can see the same with Harry Wilson. I mean, he's a player who Jurgen Klopp has talked about. We've heard him talk about him and talk about his very specific ability, which is his ability to score from range. I don't think he has the technical ability to play as one of the wide forwards for this Liverpool side apart from that. I think that's where he kind of falls down a little bit. It was the same with Ryan Kent, who moved on to Rangers and has been fantastic at Rangers and is now linked heavily to Leeds United. So that shows that there is a player there, but these players sometimes need to step away from the super clubs to develop a lot more somewhere else. And I think that if Harry Wilson, if the price in the market was there for Harry Wilson at the moment, I think he would move. I still think he'll move, but not before the start of the end of the transfer window, if you like. There are others that will come in and be around the squad. Van Berg is one, still very raw defensively, but a promising talent. Same as Hoover, the Dutch right back or centre back that they have, who's very raw but has talent. He will spend time around the first team. And the same goes for the likes of Elliott and all these different players who will come in and take that average age down. But I think going forward, as we've talked about succession plans already, I think that the signings that Liverpool make, apart from Thiago, who's a very specific signing, a very specific profile to fill a specific role, I think over the next 2 or 3 seasons, we'll see Liverpool signing players take that average age back down again because they're very intelligent and that's what smart clubs do.
Yeah, you make a really, really good point there. And I think we're kind of coming to the point where we've spoken about Liverpool, their strengths and weaknesses, how well they are, the succession plan, their key players, Henderson's role. How well do we think, or do you think Liverpool will actually do this season? Can they retain their crown? Will Chelsea spending shoot them up the league? Will City come back roaring? And will Liverpool fall a bit to the side? Or will they dominate as they have done in the past? Especially last year, but the past 2 or 3 years have been really, really strong.
Yeah, I think that this season it's going to be Man City 1, Liverpool 2. I think that there's something in these elite coaches that it's the same thing that runs in Jurgen Klopp as runs in Pep Guardiola. They're not driven by success, they're driven by failure. And it's not failure in the sense that they've failed as coaches, but they hold themselves to such high standards that Pep Guardiola will have came out of last season, obviously. There was a lot of talk last season, and it's true. The underlying statistics, when you look at XG, you look at expected points, you look at XG against, you look at shot numbers, you look at shot locations. Manchester City were the dominant side in the Premier League last season when you viewed the league through a lens of underlying advanced statistics. Of course, that doesn't matter because what matters is what happens in the pitch. And Liverpool were ruthlessly effective, and that's what saw them dominate. The amount of games that they won by 1 goal when they weren't playing well was ridiculous, and that's why they did so well. I think that Pep Guardiola has gone away over this last couple of months, and make no doubts about it. Manchester United are going to come flying out of the blocks, and they will be blowing teams away again, the similar way that we saw 2 seasons ago when they obviously just pipped Liverpool to the title via that Vincent Kompany 35-yard goal that he would never score again, no matter how many times he tried. I think that Liverpool will still be effective. They're still a strong, incredibly strong squad and a strong group of players. And it's not a case of success slowing them down. It's more a case of Manchester City coming back to a point where we'd expect them to be when they underperformed quite a lot last season. I think beyond that top 2, it then becomes really interesting in the Premier League because Manchester United finished 3rd last season. They relied so heavily on a certain core of players, and it's likely they're going to be doing so again this season. If any of those players, if Bruno Fernandes goes down with a long-term injury, Manchester United's chances, if you like, and ability to win games regresses tremendously because he's so important for them towards the end of the season post-lockdown. Then you have the likes of Arsenal, who I believe are going to come back under Arteta and be extremely effective this season. They've recruited extremely well. I really like the signing of players like Willian, who's come in, and from a cultural point of view, when you talk about squad building, he is such a good fit because he's a born winner. He's a competitor, and he's a player who will raise the levels of that Arsenal team to the next stage. And then obviously Chelsea with their spending. Nobody knows how the hell Frank Lampard is going to fit these players into a coherent team. How do you find a way to play Kai Havertz and Hakim Ziyech in the same team? Nobody knows. It's going to be fascinating to see exactly what he does from a squad perspective to keep all these players happy, having spent all this money. I believe they'll get top 4, but I don't think they'll be challenging for the title this year.
Lee, I'm starting to sweat about my fantasy football team now. So yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Chelsea, and I think I've also had this kind of, particularly with my fantasy team, to think that anyone who signs in the last week or so probably won't start if they've not been in pre-season for that team. That's been my thinking with Havertz and not Ziyech, but he's just had some injury troubles to keep them out of my team. But yeah, I think my next question was going to say, will Chelsea pose a threat to that City-Liverpool duopoly? Seemingly not there, and I think you're right about Manchester United as well. Could we just see another kind of City-Liverpool dominance this season? I think it could be correct. And we haven't talked about Tottenham Hotspur, interestingly as well, and Mourinho.
I don't know if you guys have been watching the All or Nothing documentary on Tottenham Hotspur. It's been enlightening. I don't get me wrong. I mean, what we're saying, I saw somebody talk about it on social media. They were criticising Mourinho for his team talks, which are all about passion and aggression. There's no tactical talks. We're just not being shown the tactical aspects of what he does. You see the screen behind him. They have in possession, out of possession analysis on the screen, so that those videos are being shown and talked about. I think that Tottenham are going to really, really struggle this season to find any coherent ability to attack that top 4 properly. I think that it's just such a strange circumstance to have Mourinho with this Tottenham Hotspur team. The way that one of my favourite players in European football over the last few seasons has been Tanguy Ndombele, who, when he was at Lyon, he was fantastic. He was the midfielder Liverpool should sign now in order to provide that ball progression in the centre. He's the player who would be that Thiago alternative for Liverpool if he was still at Lyon. But he just seemed to clash with Mourinho, and Mourinho's treatment of him it's just bizarre to me from a modern perspective when you talk about how coaches interact with their players. It just seems to be something that's almost so counterintuitive in the way that you would get your best out of your players, if you like. We obviously saw the same with Mourinho at Manchester United. I think that there are some other teams that are going to be really interesting to watch this season. Everybody's fascinated to watch Marcelo Bielsa at Leeds. Everybody's going to want to know if his specific brand of football can work in the Premier League. I happen to think that it can, and Leeds will be a top half team this season, and they'll build on that going forward. Southampton under Ralph Hasenhüttl are going to be fascinating to watch because there's no other coach in the Premier League who is so all-out aggressive in terms of the way he wants his teams to play with and without the ball as Hasenhüttl is. They'll be another club who I'm really looking forward to watching this season. And then you obviously have the likes of Chris Wilder, Sheffield United, who are extremely difficult to beat and who have recruited well and done well in the transfer market and seem to be building a really interesting project. So all in all, I think there's a number of really interesting teams that are going to be on show in the Premier League this coming season. There aren't going to be many easy games, that's for sure.
Absolutely. You touched on Bielsa. I believe you've got a book coming out just finally on Bielsa. So do you want to just quickly tell us a little bit about that and what your thoughts are on Leeds this season?
Yeah, I've got a book coming out. It'll be released January or February next year. The release date's not been confirmed yet. 13 Steps to the Premier League is basically talking about the tactical structures that Marcelo Bielsa has used at Leeds to get his team to play this brand of football that's so enamoured so many people. I think that the research that I've done so far into the book, the manuscript's not all written yet, has been enlightening for me because I didn't realise just how much detail goes into Bielsa's teams. You hear about it all the time, and obviously I'm someone who makes a living from the tactical side of the game, so it's something that I should know, be interested in. But there are so many different nuances to the way that they play in terms of just how they move to receive the ball and to progress the ball through the thirds. It's such an intricate style of play, if you like, and it's going to be really interesting to see that translated to the Premier League. I think that Leeds have recruited really well this season. They obviously couldn't get Ben White back to play at centre-back, which is a huge loss to them because he was the best central defender for me below the Premier League in English football last season. His ability to read the game and to always seem to be in the right position to negate the opposition attacks, but then his ability to use the ball as well and progress the ball was really important for Leeds. And they've done well to go out and get Robin Koch instead. from Freiburg, who is a player with a very similar profile, if perhaps not quite the same ceiling, if you like, in terms of potential and ability, if you like, that Ben White has. I think it'll be really interesting to see how Rodrigo, now that he's back, obviously in the Premier League, people might not remember, but he had a loan spell at Bolton Wanderers years ago. He's back in the Premier League now, and it'll be interesting to see how he fits into the system. Will he be that goal scorer that they've lacked? Because Patrick Bamford's his XG, his expected goals, is extremely high, but his actual goal output is low because at times his finishing just isn't quite there. Will Rodrigo give you that, or will he play more from a wide position? And there's a lot of questions at the moment, so I think that it's going to be something that a lot of people are watching for over the first few weeks of the Premier League season to see just how Leeds settle down and what they look like when they settle down.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the Bamford thing, because on Twitter, literally this morning, I have a diehard Leeds fan as a mate, and he sent a picture which was Patrick Bamford had missed 35 of 44 big chances last season, but ended with 16 league goals, I think, which I was really scratching my head at. It was literally the first tweet I read this morning, and it was a bit of a head scratcher. So yeah, no, it would definitely be interesting to see how Rodrigo settles in.
No, definitely. I think that, you talk about Bamford, and there's this thing doing the rounds on social media called Bamford Island, where some people are supporting Bamford no matter what, because Bamford is going to come good at the Premier League level. And the fact that he has missed so many big chances, that directly correlates to his XG being high, and his goal output being low, and the variance of that is when you start to, if you're evaluating players, you look for these variances in XG. If a player's XG is low but his goal output's high, you have to look closely at his shots in terms of valuations to see whether he is just a very, very good finisher or whether he's getting lucky. If a player's XG is high but his goal low, you do the same thing. Is he getting unlucky through deflections, through shots that hit the woodwork, through good saves from the goalkeeper, or is his finishing just poor? I think that Bamford, unfortunately, comes into the latter category when his finishing just seems loose at times. There's no doubt that there's a very talented player there, and he's someone who Marcelo Bielsa trusts. Obviously, he had Eddie Nketiah on loan last season. Eddie Nketiah is, as we talked about with Ryan Brewster earlier on, a natural-born pure goal scorer. He will score goals at any level, anywhere in the game, because that's what he does. Perhaps his link-up play and his ability to rotate and his ability to aid the progression of the ball through the thirds isn't quite as strong, and that's why Bamford was selected ahead of Nketiah, despite Nketiah being a player who would not have missed those clear-cut chances. So it's all about how coaches, I think, see different players and see different positions within their team. I think that's something that's always interesting to look for.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's all today from us. Lee, thank you very much for coming on today, and good luck with your fantasy team for the rest of the season. I'm sure you'll do better than me.
Believe me, I need it. I never do well.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And see you guys next time.